Hello, and welcome to Chapter 1 of the NSCA's Guide to Program Design. This is a really good book for any of you guys who are working with sports athletes or even for your general population that are a little bit more advanced and you need to really understand the different design elements when creating a good program. So it's a fairly heavy text if you haven't really gone through some of these dynamics before. It goes into the energy systems, it goes into the anaerobic aerobic conditioning, it goes into resistance training, the testing, evaluation of the program, it goes into stability training, agility, speed, periodization, and then implementing the programs. The reference section is a gold mine of just knowledge and research. They really put together a solid book on overall program design here. So let's go through Chapter 1. So here we have the needs analysis. The needs analysis, it's really important to understand the exact dynamics of the athlete that you're dealing with, the dynamics of the sport, the dynamics of the exact position of that athlete when they're playing that sport. So the acute variables, the 5 variables of an exercise program, are choice of exercise, order of exercise, resistance use, so that's like the weight or dynamic of the movements, the number of sets, number of rests between sets and exercises. So understanding how to sequence these, how to order the different exercises, in combination with having a good overall understanding of the sport, is really what's going to help excel the athlete that you're working with, or multiple athletes if you're working with a full team. So the needs analysis answers 3 general questions. What are the metabolic demands of the sport? What are the biomechanical demands of the sport? And what are the common injuries observed in the sport profile? So all of these go into play for building your overall design of your program, but I would definitely take the time to learn each one, and each sport, especially if you're working with a specific sport. I would go through and take some video, do some research on that sport itself. This is a good general overview and it'll give you some good dynamics, but you always want to make sure that you do your due diligence and research that sport and research the position of the athletes that you're working with as well. So, the metabolic demands of the sport. So it pretty much breaks down the difference between, like a sprint athlete or an ultra endurance athlete, a marathon runner. There's going to be different elements at play there as far as the energy demands. And then the length of play of each sport. All of these matter in how the body reacts to the stimulus of the energy demands, because all we really do in the program design world is we create a stimulus in which we want the body to react to. So you need to, in any sport, be able to train these athletes to meet and exceed the energy demands of the sport. So your program design has to be able to tax and create an appropriate response in the specific energy systems of that sport, so that the athlete, when they're playing, can stay in good position, they can stay in good health, and if their conditioning can withstand the test of either a tournament cycle of games or a one game itself, then they're less likely to get injured. So as you can see, this is a really good table of the approximate energy demands of each sport. Like gymnastics, it's very sprint driven. The ATP, CP, the creatine phosphagen system, that's very short dynamic workouts or explosive powers, kind of like a power lifter, Olympic lifter. It's very explosive initially, but there's not a lot of movement after that. So you have the lactic acid system, the glycolysis, which is about to the 2 minute range, minute and a half to 2 minutes is where this lactic acid system is really strong, and then the aerobic system. And you can have different dynamics of it switching into the different energy systems depending on your overall athlete's conditioning, but the book itself will go into that a little bit later. So you can see in soccer, it's not a very sprint-driven, sprint-heavy, explosive power. You have a fair dynamic of that when they kick the ball, but for the most part, it's pretty heavy over here in the aerobic system, where they are running up and down the field, but then you have when they switch teams who has the ball, then they're going to sprint after that athlete itself. So that's where the 25% comes in for that lactic acid system. So sometimes it's difficult when identifying a different sport on how that energy system is going to play, but you really just take some time to break down what you know about the sport and find some research out there on the sport, and that'll help you out a lot. So here's the three different systems: the phosphagens, ATP, CP system, the glycolysis, and then the Krebs cycle or the citric acid cycle. This is the aerobic system and where most endurance sports are housed. So going through those, here is where you're going to have the crossovers of the different energy systems. So here's the time of exertion within the athletic event. And then here is the overall energy of each. So, you can see the phosphagen system can create a massive amounts of force, but it does not last as far as from a long-term standpoint. If you're an Olympic lifter and you lift near or above your 1 rep max, you're only going to be able to do that in a very short amount of time before you have to renew and regenerate that energy system, and then you can come back to it. That's why the cycle times of rest are extremely important for your overall program design. Then you have the glycolysis, which is really, it's fairly quick to get a good amount of power, but it doesn't have the long-term endurance that the aerobic system does. The aerobic system takes a lot longer to produce the ATP that is needed, but as you can see, it can just keep going and going and going. So that is where you're going to be over there. Now, we're going to go into the biomechanical demands of the sport. So the biomechanical demands are at what plane of movement is the sport played in. You know what I mean? So, soccer, you have a fair amount of running back and forth. See, Olympic lifting, very, very linear. There's not a lot of side-to-side movements. It's essentially it's extension and flexion of the hips and knees, and a lot of just overall bracing of the muscles, because they have to withstand a massive amounts of load. So you want to try to identify the different ranges of motion of the joints and the length of time of each either body part or the overall body for the athletic event. And you also want to understand that each position is going to be a little bit different. So, a goalie is probably more along the lines of a sprint athlete and kind of comes across side to side, uses a bit more of the arms. They have to be able to dive and really explosively move their entire body versus the like a forward. They're going to be a lot faster on their feet. They're going to be a lot quicker to have to aim and stay in balance and stable on one foot while aiming and kicking with the other foot. So understanding those different elements can really help to identify what the demands are of the sport. Essentially, you have the open and closed dynamic of describing movement. So, like here, you have kicking a soccer ball is an example of an open chain sport event, and then American football, pushing against each other so the body is able to move, but the feet and hands are pretty stable. So that's a closed dynamic. Versus here, the open dynamic is the leg. The body is fairly stable and in place, but there's the joint structure moving in that open chain, the arm or leg. Let's see. So now I want to make sure analyzing the movements and muscle actions within the athlete's sports, strength and conditioning professionals can also determine the energy system being utilized. So remember, each section of this book always plays off of itself. So understanding the biomechanical assessments can also help you to understand the energy systems involved at each joint structure. So where the data in the previous tables demonstrated a specific energy system, but if you look at the sport, the specific joint structure, it may be a little bit different. So it's a good amount of using common sense to identify what you want to be accomplished in each one. Okay, so the biomechanical analysis, they recommend using video. Of course, always slow motion works fantastic, but you also have to understand the time domain. So maybe just regular speed with a stopwatch can help you identify the energy system at play. But right here, you're going to go into what patterns of movement. So whether it's a concentric action, eccentric, isometric, in what planes do they take place? Is it more of a frontal plane movement, sagittal? Do they have transverse movement? Do they not have transverse movement? Second, what joints are involved during this activity? Is it mostly an upper body sport? Is it a full body sport? Third, what muscles are recruited and what are the muscle actions? Is it more of a flexion driven is it more of a hamstring? Is it more of a quad? What exactly are the dynamics? Is it a fair amount of both? You know what I mean? Sometimes it's not just if this, not that. It's this and this and this. You know what I mean? So really take the time to figure out which sport you want to work with. Finally, what is the duration of time that the athlete will be actively engaged in the athletic event? So those are some key questions. You can even write those down when you're assessing each athlete if you're working one-on-one or with the sport, but also giving a fair amount of personalization to the positions. Right. So going into injury risk of the sport, I always tell my athletes, it doesn't matter how good you are at your sport, it doesn't matter how much weight you can move in the weight room, how quick you are on the field. If you get injured in the first quarter, how good of an athlete are you? And that really gets them to identify injury prevention and identifying injury risk inside of your program to making sure that we can mitigate and eliminate any injuries from a general strength standpoint is very important. So like when I'm working with baseball athletes, they have a fair amount of general strength that they do preseason, But during season, it's just to get the joints prepared enough, and hopefully you've given the body enough strength to withstand the high amount of volume that they are playing. There's a lot of games back to back, and they're standing cold and then going to a dead sprint, so there's not a lot that you can do in the season. It's more of your preseason strength and conditioning that's really going to keep these athletes uninjured throughout the season. So just thinking about that. So, there's injuries we can actually do something about, the non-impact ones. Other ones, no matter how good you are at strength and conditioning or program design, you're going to have some element of unavoidable injury, so mechanical overload of, somebody getting tackled on a weird angle on the knee. There's not much you can do to prevent that. But there is a lot you can do to prevent an ACL rupture from rupturing on foot contact with the ground, right? Making sure that the biomechanics are sound, that the athlete has enough strength to withstand the entire athletic event, and utilizing that strength properly. So going through the difference of different patterns of biomechanical movement, understanding these are really important. Internal rotation, external rotation, protraction, retraction, elevation, depression of the shoulder blade. You've got rotation, circumduction. So each joint structure has a fair amount of variance in the movements. Like a knee, it has flexion and extension. Really shouldn't have too much other than that, but the shoulder joint itself has a lot of movement. So, any sport that you have a lot more variables involved, then the injury risk increases accordingly. So they go through the two main types of injuries: contact injury and non-contact injury. One is from an external force, and the other is during acceleration of movement, so either speeding up or slowing down. These are more readily seen in change of direction movements. For example, a running back in American football who is changing direction plants his leg while moving at full speed. So then there's the overuse injuries, certain muscle groups, tendons, ligaments, joint structure of the body. A baseball athlete, they tend to have overuse injuries in the shoulders and elbows of their throwing arm. That sport doesn't typically recommend switching arms. So that's another thing to think about. So pretty much what this aspect of the chapter is saying is you have your overall fatigue, you have the breakdown of kinematics, or your biomechanics start to get a little bit wonky and they start to have some excessive movement that should not be present inside of that sport. And then you have improper loading or uncontrollable movement, which then leads to an injury. So your fatigue factor can be a main determinant for how likely someone is to get injured. What are the common injury sites? How are these injuries most likely to occur? How likely are they to occur in each sport? Which joint structure is more liable? And which athletes are prone, whether it's a position-specific injury or a predisposition. Anyone who's coming in with a previous injury is going to be predisposed to that injury, so they just need a little bit more strength and conditioning or coaching on how to make sure they stay in a good element of their kinematics so that they're not likely to get injured. So this is table 1.3 is a good common injuries of the sport and the specific position. So it goes through the exact dynamics of each one. Gymnastics, muscle strain, knee sprain, shoulder tendonitis, ankle inversion, vertebrae compression, hip strain, shoulder separation, elbow strain, and sprain. Whereas, like American football, it's mostly lower leg injuries, not so much of the upper body. But then you would have an element of the goalie could have some shoulder elements in their injury assessment as well. So when the risk of injury within a sport is combined with its biomechanical analysis, this information allows the strength and conditioning professionals to set definable risks of injury based on the athletic position within a sport. So just like we were talking about before. Athletes recovering from an existing injury may require the manipulation of training stimulus in multiple directions within a single program. So check the references for that. May provide some good insight. But what it's saying is the athlete can get stronger and faster in their range of motion even if they're not able to go through a full range of motion due to a previous injury. They can still train in their strong range of motion and make that stronger. But it is, if their sport demands excessive squats due to, like say the Olympic snatch, for instance, that requires a fair amount of knee and ankle flexibility. So no matter how strong you are in a small range of motion, if you have any weaknesses in any range of motion, that's going to really affect your overall performance. So then it goes through integrating your overall program design. So the typical overload feature is creating a stimulus inside of the body recovering slightly, so there's a dip in overall performance, and then the body reacts to that stimulus by improving the performance, improving the strength, and then that is the new norm. Functional overreaching is really testing the boundary of that so that the body can fully recover in those dynamics and still get back to that optimal stage. Functional overreaching is just it does return. When we get into non-functional overreaching, the program design causes performance to be suppressed for longer periods of time without predictable recovery. So if this is ignored, it can actually lead to injuries inside of the training domain. Last thing you want is to injure an athlete in the training room and not even in the field of play. So sometimes this can lead to several months of recovery time, which when you're working with athletes, sometimes you have a very small window of opportunity to allow for these athletes to grow stronger, and you're giving them the best dynamics that you can in the scenarios at which you guys are working on. So going into that, it just pretty much says work with your team itself, making sure that you have a fair amount of speed and power components as well as aerobic training. Right here it says, in contrast, athletes in aerobic endurance sports benefit from heavy resistance training because of the need to strengthen the tissue and prevent injuries. So like I was talking with some of the baseball athletes, they can benefit from that because it allows them a buffer of sorts to prevent injury in the tissues and in the ligaments throughout the season. So remember, you're not just working on one game here, you're working on a season and year to year. So proper periodization and rest periods are important to recovery and reducing overtraining. So the summary points: strength and conditioning professionals must carefully evaluate the individual athlete and the sport in order to understand the needs within the resistance training program and the demands of a total conditioning program. The essential aspects of a needs analysis for any athlete include the metabolic demands, biomechanical demands, and potential injury risk of the sport. Integrating the resistance training program with other conditioning activities is an important aspect for total conditioning. Training goals must be prioritized, training must be periodized, and non-functional overreaching and overtraining must be addressed. Professionals must be dedicated to improving the physical development of athletes within the construct of their age, psychological development, physical toleration of training, and proper progression of the program. As such, a needs analysis is a vital part of the design of any conditioning program, especially the resistance training program. So I've provided some of the references of this chapter in the Facebook group itself. So make sure you guys take a look at those, and that'll really help you to identify and understand the elements of this chapter itself. So, uh, anyways, hope that gave you a good overview of the chapter. Make sure you guys read through it. If you have any questions, pop it into the Facebook group so that we can all work together to help each other out. All right, you guys. Hope that was good, and see you on chapter 2.